Then with that entity, I will reign with blood and horror on this earth.
Depart.
Let me begin today with the central idea right up front rather than making you wait for it. That being, the existence of suffering does not automatically disprove God. From a Latter-day Saint perspective, suffering and evil may actually be evidence that moral agency is actually real and meaningful. If agency is real, then the possibility of wrong choices must be real too. And if wrong choices are real, then suffering becomes possible, not because God delights in his children experiencing and feeling pain, but because he's made freedom genuine. Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Martin Braden, and this is part of an ongoing video series I'm doing called Faith, Reason, and the Search for Truth, where we're actually examining the deepest questions about God, meaning, and belief. For your convenience, I've set up a playlist titled Faith, Reason, and the Search for Truth, where I'm saving all of the videos from this series. Today we're going to turn to one of the most emotionally powerful challenges to anyone having a belief in God, the problem of suffering and evil. You've likely heard it framed like this: if God is good and if God is all-powerful as people of faith say he is, then why does suffering exist? Why is there so much disease, and why is there so much injustice, cruelty, and natural disasters, especially when it comes to innocent children? This is not an abstract philosophical puzzle. This is personal. In fact, a lot of people don't reject God because of science. They've rejected him because of all the suffering they see throughout the world. And that reality deserves to be met with empathy and seriousness, rather than dismissal or shallow answers. Everyone who lives long enough encounters suffering, either directly or through the suffering of someone they love. That's why this question deserves our serious consideration. It deserves humility, and it deserves honesty. It should never be dismissed with slogans, and it should never be answered with shallow platitudes. Elder Neil A. Maxwell once said, "If pain were not real, faith would not be tested. If sorrow were not real, growth would not be real." Many people assume that suffering disproves the existence of God. But before we accept that conclusion, we need to carefully examine the reasoning behind it. Because the argument from evil rests on an assumption that often goes unspoken. The assumption is this: if God exists, then God should have created a world with no pain, no opposition, no danger, and no tragedy. But we need to pause and ask a deeper question. Would such a world even be capable of producing meaningful human lives? From a Latter-day Saint perspective, the answer is no. The Book of Mormon teaches something profound about the very structure of reality. Lehi taught it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things. See 2 Nephi 2, verse 11. The qualities we admire most in human beings, courage, resilience, mercy, sacrifice, perseverance, simply cannot exist in a world where nothing meaningful is at stake. Lehi explains that without opposition there would be no agency. Without agency there would be no accountability. And so if there's no real possibility of choosing wrongly, then there is no real possibility of choosing rightly. In other words, if there's no risk, there's no courage. If there's no pain, there's no compassion. And if there's no difficulty, there's no growth. Think on that for a moment. Let it sink in. A world without suffering would not be a world of moral beings. It would be a world of programmed creatures. Robots, in other words. Now let me be very clear. This does not make suffering easy. It does not make tragedy acceptable. It does not erase grief. It does not remove heartbreak. But it does change the logic. The presence of suffering isn't evidence that God doesn't exist. It's actually evidence that moral agency itself is real. President Russell M. Nelson taught, "Agency is God's gift to his children. It is fundamental to our progression." End quote. Progression implies growth, and growth requires resistance. In other words, refinement cannot occur in a perfectly comfortable environment. And here's where this connects directly to something we explored in the previous video. Atheist Richard Dawkins and others have argued that God should simply make himself unmistakably visible so the debate could be settled once and for all. But that demand overlooks something crucial. If God's existence was made mathematically undeniable, irrefutable in other words, belief would no longer be meaningful choice. It would simply be compliance with overwhelming, irrefutable evidence. In other words, if God's existence were probable in the same way physical facts are probable, agency itself would collapse, for we would be compelled to believe. Belief would no longer be chosen or a choice. It would be a compelling to believe. And the opposite is also true. If God's non-existence were provable with absolute certainty, meaning especially the meaning of life itself would simply collapse. Moral obligation would become an illusion, and the hope beyond death would become a total and complete fiction. Love that is compelled is not love. Obedience that is forced is not righteousness. Faith that has no alternative is not faith at all. This is why God doesn't force us to love him. What we find ourselves living in instead is a world where neither position is coercively provable. And that is not a design flaw. It is, in fact, from a Latter-day Saint perspective, precisely the point. It's on purpose. This world is structured to preserve moral agency for a very specific reason. Belief can now be meaningful because it can be chosen, just like love for another person is very meaningful because it is chosen. Richard Dawkins says he cannot choose to believe because there is, in his worldview, so much evidence against choosing belief in God. But in everyday life, we constantly choose what evidence we trust, what experiences we honor, and what interpretations we accept and take ownership of. Belief is not a switch you can just turn on and off. It is a posture of the soul. Using this metaphor is to describe something real but hard to capture in purely technical language. A posture of the soul is about orientation, not just opinion. It's not just what you think, it's how you are oriented toward truth. Two people can hear the same evidence, right? One leans toward openness, humility, willingness to consider. The other leans towards resistance, cynicism, unwillingness to engage. That difference is not just intellectual, it's dispositional. A posture of the soul includes things like, are you open to being wrong? Are you willing to sincerely seek? Are you humble enough to ask questions? Are you willing to act on what you learn? Are you receptive to spiritual impressions? In Alma 32 it says, even if you can no more than desire to believe, let that desire work in you. That's posture. It's the orientation of the heart toward belief even before certainty arrives. Moroni 10 says, ask God with a sincere heart, with real intent. So again, it's not just intellectual inquiry. It's an inner orientation. In the Doctrine and Covenants, section 9, we read, you must study it out in your mind. Then you must ask me, the Lord. This requires effort, plus openness, plus sincerity, which equals posture. Why this matters for belief is because belief isn't formed only by logic. It's formed by character, experience, humility, willingness, desire, trust, memory, and lastly, interpretation. Two people can see the same facts and land differently because their posture towards truth is different. That doesn't mean one is dishonest. It means belief involves more than raw data. In everyday language, it's like this. A posture of the soul is leaning towards hope instead of cynicism. It's leaning towards seeking instead of dismissing. It's leaning towards trust instead of suspicion and leaning towards humility instead of certainty. The bottom line is, it's the difference between if God is real, I want to know, versus there is no God and I'm not open to considering otherwise. So, with that said, God's apparent hiddenness may not be evidence of his absence, but in fact it may be evidence of his respect for human freedom, he having given us that freedom through having moral agency. Now here's something deeply important. The argument from evil assumes the existence of objective moral standards. When someone says this suffering is wrong, they are not merely expressing preference, they are making a moral claim. But if the universe is purely material, I would ask, where does wrong come from? Genocide is not just unfortunate, it is wrong. Abuse is not just unpleasant, it is wrong. C.S. Lewis once said, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. Moroni taught the Spirit of Christ is given to every man, that he may know good from evil. That's Moroni 7, verse 16. Our moral institutions feel less like accidental byproducts of evolution and more like echoes of a real moral law written into our conscience. God does not override agency, even when agency is used destructively, and that's because doing so would destroy the very conditions that make love and growth possible. Jeffrey R. Holland once said, "In a world of agency, God will not stop you from hurting someone, but he will hold you accountable for it. This life is not the reward. This life is the formation." Quote, Viktor Frankl wrote, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. When suffering has meaning, endurance becomes possible." End of quote. Meaning does not remove pain, but it transforms suffering from something merely destructive into something potentially refining. This, from a Latter-day Saint perspective, is God's work and glory, the bringing to pass of the immortality and eternal life of his children through having his children learning these laws of agency, choice, and refinement while living in a world where suffering must be present. I hope you don't mind me sharing with you a personal experience our family went through. I'm hopeful that it brings to you further light on the subject of today's video on suffering and evil. More than 19 years ago, our son Garrett had only been married just 7 weeks when he and his lovely wife were headed to a special marriage class. His sweetheart was the driver. There was a very anxious and impatient young man of 19 who was also driving along the Spaghetti Bowl part of the freeway in a small pickup truck here in Salt Lake. He wanted to get past this big semi-truck that had slowed him down, and so he pulled over to the right side of the truck and wham! That was exactly where Garrett and his bride had parked. It was a safety zone. They had just pulled to that side of the road because Candace was experiencing a major migraine headache and wanted Garrett to take over the driving. Right as they were in the middle of switching seats, Candace moving to the back seat and Garrett sliding over to the driver's seat, they were hit in the back of their small car by this young man's truck that was going 80 miles an hour. Our Garrett was killed instantly and stepped into eternity, and his sweet bride Candace was taken to the hospital where she recovered after a week or two in the hospital and then some home care. This is a mental picture of part of the dream I had shortly after Garrett's tragic death. I shared more details of this dream in my introduction to my book, An Atheist Delusion, so you can check that out. Here's an imagined picture of my son Garrett, my wife Kathleen, and I reveling in the glorious presence of the Lord, rejoicing for the reality that there is certainly life after death. More than 43 years ago, my wife gave birth to a stillborn, a little baby boy named Marty Jr. He was alive in Kathleen's womb right up to the month before he was to be born, but then he stopped kicking. We found out that he was no longer alive, and a month later, Kathleen gave birth to our dead baby. This is a picture that shows what I had revealed to me as I wrote a song I titled, "You Are Crowned Without the Conflict," and became my angel child. As you heard, I've had my share of tragedy, suffering, and evil throughout my life. That being true of me and you, I would have you consider that the idea that the problem of suffering and evil doesn't disprove God, and in fact, I'm suggesting to you that although suffering and evil reveals something difficult, it also reveals something profound. This world was never intended to be painless. It was intended to be formative. Formative means character building, soul shaping, and growth producing. And so this life, as it's been set up, is designed to shape us, not to comfort us. A formative experience is one that develops your character, strengthens your capacity to love, teaches wisdom through experience, refines humility and builds resilience, and it shapes who you are becoming. And so when these laws that shape our world are applied to life itself, the idea is life isn't meant to be painless. It's meant to change us, to develop us, and turn us into new creatures through the gospel plan that Jesus Christ came to give efficacy to. LDS doctrine teaches this very directly. In Abraham 3:25 we read, "We will prove them herewith, to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them." This life is a proving ground, not a comfort resort. It is a testing place and not a resting place. Ether 12:27 says, and I quote, I give unto men weaknesses that they may be humble. Weakness isn't an accident. It's part of the refining process. In Doctrine and Covenants 122:7, we find more support to this understanding when the Lord told Joseph Smith, while he suffered for nearly 7 months in Liberty's jail, all these things shall give thee experience and shall be for thy good. Not enjoyable, but ultimately shaping, isn't it? A simple way to say it is, instead of it was intended to be formative, you could say this life is meant to shape us. This life is designed for growth and not for entertainment. This world is a training ground for the soul. This life is meant to refine us, not shelter us. And why does this matter? Because it reframes the problem of suffering and evil. Instead of, if suffering exists, God must not exist. The LDS framework says, suffering exists because growth is the purpose of mortality. That doesn't make suffering easy, but it makes suffering meaningful rather than absurd. In the next video, we will explore whether morality itself can exist in a purely material universe, or whether our sense of right and wrong points beyond biology. Until then, I invite you to reflect on this. Would you really want a world where no one could choose wrongly, if it also meant no one could truly choose rightly? Until next time, I wish you continued success. Goodbye. Love you.